Ian, thanks for being with us today. Kyiv Post is delighted to have you come by. You're a well-known historian and you've done a lot of research about Russia. Could you tell us a little bit about your research and your own background?
Absolutely. So my research combines approaches from history, political science, and literature and culture, literary and cultural studies, because I think all of these things work really well together. Because what really motivates me is understanding how war is important to constructing identity, to constructing the kind of myths and stories that nations use to guide themselves within Russia. So, of course, in Russia, we're looking at way back hundreds of years, war is the common thread that draws Russia together, thinking about, even the 19th century, 1812, Tolstoy. Of course, the Second World War is the big one, and I'm sure we'll get onto that. But even today in Ukraine, I would love to see people using similar methods to my methods, and I would love to talk to anyone who would like to do so, to think about how Ukraine is forming a national identity and forming a really strong myth and story of itself over the last 8 months and hopefully into the future.
It's fantastic. So I know in your first book, Stalingrad Lives, Stories of Combat and Survival, the battle, which cost nearly 1.2 million lives, is often cited though as a turning point in the war, in that it prevented the Germans from taking over Soviet Russia. And your book argues, and I quote, tragedy was written as triumph, and that the loss and destruction of unimaginable scale, Soviet readers and writers embraced the story of martyred Stalingrad, embedding it into the Russian psyche for decades to come. Why is that, and how do you see that playing out in modern day Russia?
Well, the story in Stalingrad Lives, it really is quite extraordinary what happened there and the way that this myth of Stalingrad was born. The Soviets, on day one of the war, went out and recruited the absolute best fiction writers in the country, who were all really excited to come and work for the state and sell the war narrative, because they saw that the country really was under threat from the invading German army. So people like Vasily Grossman, Konstantin Simonov, Ilya Ehrenburg, Sholokhov wasn't at Stalingrad. These are big names. These are real authors with great talent. In particular, Grossman, of course, who's such an interesting figure for not just what he did during the war, but what became of him after the war. And so these guys went off to Stalingrad and they were in the trenches. And they were highly traumatized by what they saw, even though by then they were extremely experienced writers. They'd been at the front for a long time. And they came up with this story that was extremely persuasive for a traumatized nation, a nation that genuinely was shattered. And of course, I'm saying the nation and meaning the Soviet Union and all of the peoples there. This story that Stalingrad had to die. And this is really what's important when we start to think about the present and the hold that war has over Russians today. The idea not that just the death of 1 million Soviets was a regrettable tragedy, but somehow it was essential. There is a sort of quasi-religious element in this. The idea when we think of, for example, the Passion of the Christ, the idea that Jesus had to die to save the world. When we in the West, we think about World War II, we think about the phrase never again. Right?
Mm-hmm.
We're glad that we won and we remember the deaths, but we hope that it never has to happen again. But the Russian story of World War II is very much the death was essential. The sacrifice was essential to save the world at Stalingrad, and Stalingrad itself in the stories becomes a sort of a person and is killed and somehow resurrected again. And these stories are really, really readable. They're very inspiring. And you can imagine that when you're a Soviet ordinary Ivan in Chelyabinsk, and your folks are off dying at the front, that these stories give you something to hold on to. They tell you that all of the sacrifices are not in vain. And that's a very moving story. And it was necessary in World War II because the threat of the Nazis was so extreme.
So let me ask you though, so that's a historical research that you've done, but now your next book out, spring of 2023, Z Generation, Into the Heart of Russia's Fascist Youth. So this is about the modern era and what's going on with Russia, what they believe. How does it relate? What do you see in modern Russia? What do you see in this Z generation today that makes it different from the generation of the Stalingrad era?
Well, what I think is interesting is we all know about the cult of World War II in Putin's Russia. I don't need to reintroduce that theme. But bear in mind the idea of that sacrifice element, the idea of the necessary sacrifice. And what we're seeing today is the idea of And when I think of the Z generation, I apologize, I'm going to call it Z generation, not Z generation. I'm thinking of kids who are maybe under the age of 18, who don't remember a Russia, certainly a Russia before Putin, who don't remember a Russia of differing possibilities, let's say, in the early to mid 2000s when Russia might have become something different. These are kids who are growing up with the narrative of war, the narrative of sacrifice surrounding them, who are being trained to perform war when they dress up in the costumes and they go to the parades, who are being trained to recite the poetry, to sing the songs. And some of them seem quite banal, right? You know, when they read a touching Konstantin Simonov poem from the war, you know, wait for me, I'll come back. It's quite nice. But when it's matched with the other stuff that's much more extreme, the groups of child soldiers, the youth army, the movements to train young children in paramilitary activities and to inculcate them with the idea that war is on the horizon and they may have to sacrifice themselves for the country. We're looking at a generation in particular, as now Putin is trying to cut off information from the outside, who may struggle to conceive, and I think this is a worst case scenario, but it's worth outlining that worst case scenario, a generation that may struggle to conceive of an identity for themselves that is not Russian and sacrificial, Russian and warlike.
So what's in the mind of Putin? Right? Tell me what do you think his ideology is? What is it that drives him? What is it? I mean, as you know, the Nazis had the occult, which they're very big into, and it's hard to believe that senior leaders really believe something that's so wacky, but they do, and it's what motivates them. It drives them to war. What do you think goes through the minds of the leadership of the Kremlin?
So I think in the West generally we've been underplaying the extent to which the Russian leadership really is committed to an ideology. Now it's an ideology that is, as you point out, highly irrational. It does not make sense. The idea that the more death you have, the greater the sacrifice, the greater the eventual return is completely illogical. However, it is clear that enough people believe this in Russia that they are willing to see the benefits of a war that is currently clearly a losing war, because they think in mythical terms. Right? This is, and I've mentioned the words, I think I've used the words cult, I've used the words quasi-religious, right? When we look at some of the more extreme movements in, for example, the States, we can accept that they're cult-like and religious and people really believe the things that they're saying. So why should it not be true in Russia too? We look for logic where maybe there is no logic. And I will be very, very happy to be proved wrong, right? But we need to be aware of these possibilities.
When the war ends, though, what do you do with the whole population that's been filled with these sorts of this propaganda for so long that they've adopted a lot of this ideology? They sincerely believe it at this point. How do you denazify or debathify the psyche of these people so they reject this ideology, which is so violent and dangerous?
It's going to be extremely difficult. And you need only look at the denazification process in post-war Germany to understand how difficult it is. And I think even today, historians are really struggling to, or striving to understand the flaws in that denazification process. But I think there is hope. There is hope in understanding the ways in which we've managed to de-radicalize Islamic fundamentalists, in particular in the last 20 years. However, the difficult thing is going to be that, you know, let's say that Putin's regime collapses tomorrow spectacularly, Russia falls apart, right? And people are talking about splitting Russia apart and getting rid of the country itself. Well, maybe that happens. But the real difference in the way that the ideology spreads today versus 60 years ago, 70 years ago, is that it is not attached to any one institution. It exists in social media groups. It exists in TikTok videos. It exists in threads and trends and bubbles where it can constantly, consistently spread. And this is, I think, one of the reasons it's been so insidious in Russia. Even if you don't believe it, even if you consider yourself a sort of a neutral person, you're still getting flashes of it. When you load up your VK page, your uncle, your brother, your cousin will still have liked or shared a post that is extremely, let's say, out there. And so you pick up on it. It becomes part of your world, and it becomes normalized to hear that material. So I think it's going to be up to us in the West and in Ukraine too. And I understand that right now we can't ask Ukrainians to go and spend their valuable resources doing this. But if we think of the long term, think of that generation of children who are being indoctrinated into war. How can we intervene? Well, we can intervene in social media networks. We can show positive examples of what it means to be Russian and peaceful. You could be orthodox and go out and work in the community rather than orthodox and warlike, for example. There are many, many ways that we can do this, but we have to take it seriously. And you know what? It's going to be cheap. This is going to be a bargain compared to fighting a hot war with all of the economic fallout, let alone the loss of human lives that goes with that.
Absolutely. Ian, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.